Okay, welcome everybody. So excited to be here. I want to introduce myself and then get into the meat of our webinar today. Thank you all for joining us from wherever you are. My name is Sasha Dichter. I'm the co-founder and CEO of 60 Decibels. And I'm very, very excited to have Martina Castro here from BII. In this webinar today, what we're going to be doing is really showing how BII is using 60 Decibels Signal, which is an online software that gives investors access to social outcomes data from more than 1,000 companies around the world. We think this conversation is interesting, we hope, to anyone who has really been living in this world of impact, has been focused on both the opportunity and the struggle to get relevant, actionable data as part of deals, as part of how capital is allocated, and as part of how, as an investor, you understand both companies and funds that you might invest in. And so we're going to look at three things in this conversation. And Martina is going to cover how poverty data is being used from Signal as a core part of BII's investment process. Also, how BII is using Signal to look both at funds and various geographies where they might invest in, and ultimately what that means in terms of the business case for getting outcomes data into more parts of how BII does what it does. And then at the end, we will have a surprise. We are going to show you a new feature that is going to be publicly available that is not being launched yet. And we're going to actually ask all of you to tell us what you think of it, what you want more of, what you want less of. So please stay till the end because we really need your votes. I'll introduce Martina. She's the Director and Head of Analytics and Insights at British International Investments. She leads the organization's impact measurement and analytics strategy to make sure that there are robust frameworks for the investment process and for KPI alignment. Martina has been working for more than a decade in impact management and economic development across Africa, South Asia, advising on private sector development and designing systems that derive measurable outcomes. And she's a long friend of 60 Decibels. So Martina, thank you for taking the time with us. We really appreciate it. Over to you, Martina. What I have noticed before we get into specifically how BII is using Signal, I think there was a lot of spade work, if you will, that was done by BII to get to the point that this would be needed. And what I mean specifically about that is, I've been in the sector for 2 decades now, hard to believe. And I think the conversation about moving beyond outputs data has been going on for almost the entire time that I've been in the sector. The operationalization of that intent is not easy, and certainly is not easy in larger institutions. And so BII did a lot of work before coming to the conclusion that you wanted to work with 60 decibels and before coming to the conclusion that there are specific steps in your investment process that actually required outcomes data. And so I would love if you just start us there with a little bit of history about how BII got to that point, because I feel like that internal work is probably, very relevant to our audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Sasha. So, yeah, as you say, none of this is easy or straightforward. It's not easy or straightforward anywhere, and it's not easy or straightforward in a DFI that is as diversified and sort of broad reaching in scope as BII. And I don't want to sort of pretend the story started where it started for convenience, but I do think we really did accelerate on this at the start of our current strategy in 2022. That's not to say we hadn't looked at outcome data beforehand. We had, but not in a very sort of systematic way. And it was definitely not a key driver, as you say, or a key step of our investment process. And what changed in 2022 is that we really redefined our strategy in terms of what it was trying to achieve. And it focuses on three strategic objectives: productive, sustainable, and inclusive development. And a key element of inclusive development for us, or the way we define it, is reaching low-income populations. So we were clear we don't want this to just be a reporting metric. We weren't going to use low-income people just as a sort of metric to put in our report at the end of the year. We wanted for it to be key about how we thought about strategy, about origination, prioritization, and to do that, we needed data. So we started that by looking at our portfolio and trying to understand actually what does even good look like for an organization like ours? What is our portfolio telling us about our low income reach? And we actually, in partnership with 60 Decibels, we ran 2 sprints sprint in India with 2 dozen companies, really trying to understand what stakeholders our investments were reaching. And subsequently, we ran a similar effort in Africa. And what we were trying to do there is just understand where are the sectors, the business models, where that are most inclusive, and how can we double down on those. So that helped inform strategy and origination at the sort of macro level for the organization. But what we also did was we designed, as part of our impact score, which is comprised of 3 elements: productive score, sustainable score, and inclusive score. So as part of that inclusive score, which is both is given at for each investment, both pre-investment and subsequently, so post-investment. This inclusion score is derived in one of 2 ways. You either go with a general country score, which is sort of informed by the level of poverty of different countries, but that is actually a fairly conservative score. Or you get your inclusive score basically by knowing who is it that you're reaching, that investment is reaching. And the score really incentivizes us to know who we're reaching because it gives you that upside. And so that's how we
And
really,
just to be clear,
yeah,
Martina, so that means that every deal that goes through, like post the 2022 strategy, every deal that goes to investment committee gets scored in this way
yeah.
across those 3 elements. And then the operationalization, which perhaps made it easier to get this to actually be agreed to, was you could actually come across a score for all 3 of those numbers in relatively accessible ways. But it sounds like part of your observation was I could understand the poverty level in a given geography, in a given country. That might be a blunt instrument, but at least so it was both kind of ambitious, but also I think achievable from day one. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it is fair to say. So any investment can go through just by its country score, but again, that's less generous. And so there is a very sort of implicit, explicit incentive to try to know wherever possible who is it that we're reaching.
Yeah.
Um, That, however, is not easy because, again, for an organization like ours, with anywhere between 70 and 100 investments every year, it's quite hard to get that level of detail. Sometimes, I mean, there are rare cases where the company has that information, but more often than not, they don't. And before Signal, our option was, if we didn't want to go down the country score sort of route, was to commission primary research like
Right.
60 decibel studies or others to determine reach. And
And
that's,
just curious when that all happened. I mean, again, a lot what we see is 2 things. One is to the extent to which an investor is looking at outcomes data, it is very much post-investment rather than pre. And then secondly, to the extent to which that's happening, it is really in a specialized team rather than the deal teams. So again, I'm just wondering, are there any sort of interesting dynamics about getting the deal teams like, whoa, now this is other thing. It's not hard enough to find deals as it is. Now I have this thing. So I'm just wondering, without getting into, too many stories that aren't shareable, was that a difficult place to come to? Or, did it really, since it came from the strategy, it was straightforward. I'm just sort of curious how it felt.
no, and I think we were aware that this was going to create some grit in the system, and that again, like we didn't, as much as we're fairly lucky in terms of our resourcing, we didn't have the time sometimes just because of the deal dynamics and not having the time to run a survey. These surveys, still cost money, and so that was not always appropriate. But it was creating frustration within the system, and we were trying to solve it through other ways. So one of the ways we tried to solve it was by creating proxies. So, for example, just by knowing sort of earnings of employees or land owner, like how much land a farmer owned, we could derive sort of low income percentages and assumptions around that. But that wasn't perfect either. And it was becoming somewhat of an issue in the organization as people wanted to try and knew that these investments were reaching low income but couldn't quite prove it.
And the impact of that would be a deal, as you said, if you're using national numbers, for example, just on poverty. Obviously, they're 3 dimensions, but we'll stick to poverty profile. If you're using national numbers, it might be too conservative, so you might pass on a deal, or I assume just kind of ask more questions, and it could just impact the process. Is that right?
It could be both. which would sometimes impact how much the deal was prioritized. It would definitely ask more, like end up having more questions. And just as sort of a reminder is that our impact score organizationally also is directly linked to our part of our bonus. So there were
Really?
a number of incentives for which people strongly felt we wanted better data and to really get this data somehow in a cost efficient and very quick way, which is where
That's
Signal
amazing.
comes in.
I'll just pause for a second now that we have more than 150 people on. If you would like to, just so people know who's here, just throw into the chat what organization you're from, anything else, name, position, whatever you like, just so people kind of know who's here. As we get to the Q&A, that will become more relevant. Great. So Martina, why don't we get into some of the details then? So then, as I understand it, um, this impact score becomes part of the investment process. It is a gate effectively to get deals through. It could slow a deal down, could stop a deal, or could accelerate a deal, I assume, if it has a very strong impact score, amongst other things. And so it also sounds like the data you had was not really allowing you to do what you wanted to do. And so I'm just wondering if you can then talk us through a specific example. And again, what we're going to try to get to, if we have time, is as now I understand it, and we have watched an evolution just to say, we asked Martina here particularly because BII's practice, as you can all hear, is so integrated and really so forward-leaning. And that said, there has been a process of finding a deal and doing deal work versus doing sectoral work versus doing fund investment work versus doing research, right? So there's really those three use cases: deals as a direct investor, LPs into GPs, and then just overall research. And again, I think that when you originally log into the platform, I think there's a sense of I'm going to find a deal, and if the deal is not there, then there's not really much I'm going to do. And BI has been really partnering with us to think about how those pieces come together. So with that in mind, maybe we can just start with an individual deal. Like, how does that work in practice? Obviously, there's the deal is on the platform, the deal is not on the platform. Maybe we can walk that through. And I believe Louis might share his screen as a little bit of a visual aid for those who want to follow along.
Yeah. And just before I go into examples, just to say, like, we've been working together and we've been sort of partnering with 60 Decibels for a very long time. And I knew you were sitting on a lot of data, and I think I nagged you quite a lot on can we get some of this data rather than drip feeding it through individual studies. And so I was absolutely delighted when Signal was brought on as a product. And the way we use it, and I'll go through three examples, is we say we're looking at a specific company. So an example of a company that we recently invested is a Nigerian company. It's a very specific business model. And we were really excited to sort of go into Signal, type in the name of this organization, and get like everything we wanted to know about this organization, including our poverty reach. And I will just say, poverty reach is this key aspect of our inclusion, which is a key aspect of our impact score and our strategic objectives. It is absolutely not the only way in which we assess the impact merits of a transaction. We very much look at other aspects of the data that Signal provides, net promoter score, quality of life improvements, etc. So this is a key data point for sure. It's not the only data point we look at, but you can see here examples of like really interesting, useful data that we can use for impact assessment, including the poverty reach.
And I should mention, by the way, that what everyone is seeing right now is we're not sharing any data. So these are all anonymized companies, so that you can just get a sense. But so Martina, just to understand. So use case number one, I think it sounds like it's the most straightforward. There's a deal. You want to see if the deal is on the platform. If it's there, it gives you the data, it informs the score. Seems, very, very straightforward.
Yeah.
But there's another version of that story, which I think is less obvious, which is, okay, well, then the deal's not on the platform. Obviously, we have, lots and lots of companies that we worked with for the past 10 years or so, but, the world is a very big place. So then you had mentioned again, specifically, just how we talked about its operationalization. You would say, okay, well, what's the poverty level in
Yeah.
Kenya, Uganda, India, etc. And that obviously doesn't give you what you want. But how do you then narrow it down and say, okay, I can't find that exact company, but we're going to have a process that's reasonably formalized to understand more about the company I'm looking at, even though 60 Decibels hasn't worked with that company.
Yeah, absolutely. So another example, and I think a really good one that Signal actually has amazing comparators is what we call these comparators. So we had this company, it's an MFI in India. It wasn't on the platform, but 60 Decibels so happens to have a very deep set of data points around MFIs in India and the average reach. And so we have a series of guidelines that defines what a good comparator company is. We're very lucky to have a lot of good comparator companies on Signal, and so we use that data. And we always sort of go on the conservative end when we're looking at comparators, but that gave us what we felt was a very good, credible number on what the average reach of that company could be based on comparator companies. So that was a
And
very good
what can you
example.
just talk a little bit about like what I mean, are you comparing, I mean, obviously business model and geography are the most obvious ones, but then from there, just in terms of the choices that you all have made, is it size? Is it stage? Is it funding round? Like, how do you actually make that real? Do you prefer to have five that seem like a great match? Do you look at the five and that's 50 and kind of do both? Like, so I've one, it's like two-part question, I guess.
Yeah,
One, what choices did you make? And then two, so you get this data. Are you literally then taking this data and saying, okay, we think the average is this, the range is this. Both I'm curious about how it produces a score, but my understanding is as well, it also produces avenues for inquiry with that company. Because what you're going to find is um, sort of what the number might be and what the range might be, right? And the range, I think, is telling you a lot about what's possible. So I guess I'm curious about both those things, how you narrow it down and why.
yeah,
And then what does that mean in terms of what you then feel like you know about the company
yeah,
and don't know, right?
yeah, absolutely. So in an ideal world, you would narrow it down by all the things you described. In the reality of the world, I think we really narrow it down, geography and sector being the first two, and then wherever possible and where that gives us a decent sort of number of data points, we try to narrow it down further. So we look at things like state of maturity, because we know that tends to affect how companies sort of end up developing in terms of their inclusion. We can further refine it, and there's more filters that you see on the screen that can help. I think generally where we end up, except maybe with the case I was mentioning earlier of sort of Indian MFI, we do end up most of the time refining it down to sector and sector and the country, sorry, and that gives us usually 45 comparator points. And then we look at that range and we sort of, as I was saying, always try to go at the sort of more conservative end of that range. Those tend to be, I will say, those, our judgment calls and our conversations that we have on our impact panel, which is a governance mechanism we have within BII. Sometimes I will also say the other good way to find a comparator is if a company tells you my business model is very similar to company Y, and then you go and look if company Y is on there. So that's another way to go about it. So a few ways, Sasha, I didn't quite answer your question as structured as you asked the question, but that we go about it. And I think range is quite important
Yeah.
in many cases because there are varieties of different models in each of these sectors, geography cuts. And so you do want to actually look at how different those can be. And then, as you say, that really helps guide diligence questions. And we look into Signal like the moment a deal comes over our desks, I feel like people go into Signal and start looking at compare it if that data is there and if not comparators. So this is not left at the very end of the due diligence process.
That's great. And then, I mean, my understanding is, I mean, I can imagine were I the investor and I were told, find deals the way you've always found deals, but also there's this additional stuff that you might feel like, okay, this is harder. My understanding is though that post getting the data, there are actually deals that have gone through that otherwise wouldn't have, because actually the proxy approach that you had was giving you kind of worse numbers than the company numbers. Does that happen? And then I guess so I'm curious if that happens, but then also I'm curious then I'm sure there's an acculturation process of the investment teams kind of incorporating this and frankly, fully getting on board because at the end of the day, when you're a person doing deals, you do want to get deals done, and anything that makes that harder probably can be a bit frustrating. So I'm just wondering how that has played out.
Yeah. No, so what you mentioned absolutely happens. And I will say, actually, I feel the embedding of Signal has been actually incredibly smooth. It's a very user-friendly platform, very easy to navigate, very intuitive. It actually like you can really use it in a variety of ways. And I really feel it's one of those, go-to tools that now people use. And they don't see it as something that makes anything harder. It makes things
Yeah.
easier. And again, it is a conversation that starts pre-screening, very early stage. and it really sets the tone for the rest of the conversation. So I wouldn't, it actually hasn't caused any issues. It's solved a lot of issues, and I think teams
Interesting.
have fully embraced it.
Fascinating. And then maybe we can just broaden out a little bit because I think, again, one of the less obvious use cases is, and we've seen, obviously, you wear two hats. You, as BII, you're a GP and an LP. And we've seen, LPs use this as a way to understand either new funds or existing funds. And again, so it's just a question of how you think about aggregation. So I'm wondering how that happens, and again, if there's anything that's been surprising about that process.
Yeah, and we use it in funds quite a lot. Pre-investment, we encourage our fund managers to then start collecting this data post-investment. Could be also through Signal, but pre-investment, say there's a energy access fund that we've been sort of looking at and diligencing. They don't have the data for their low income reach, but we through Signal have amazing sort of very rich data on what off-grid solar companies that fund would be targeting. So again, you sort of look at maturity, you try to make sure there's a sort of good enough representation between maturity of the businesses that this fund was targeting, the geographies and the sector. And you actually get with very, in this case, quite consistent data points on what the average reach is. That was a very sort of easy way to say what we think this fund should be achieving at the very least, like these levels. And then post investment, we would ask the fund to use platforms like Signal, use 60 decibels, use other methodologies to then inform our reporting. And the ex post scoring would mostly reflect that actual numbers, hopefully. So that's how we would work with a fund. And then the other way we would work with this data is, and again, it's such like rich data that you can actually start using it to develop impact thesis across entire strategies. And so you can think about, okay, well, this type of strategy should be giving me this type of inclusion outcomes. And it helps set the bar for what good looks like, which I think is the other really fascinating part about this. As impact professionals, like that's the holy grail, having benchmarks and knowing what good looks like. And this is a great source of that.
Yeah, so Louis is actually showing what that functionality looks like. Louis, do you want to just tell people what you just did? Because Louis is like the best person in the world at navigating, and I always try to keep up with him. So maybe Louis, you can give us 60 seconds on what people are looking at here.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a new feature that we're about to roll out. It's still very much being built, but what this allows you to do is to create groups. So as you saw, I basically handpicked like 9 companies, which I thought might be relevant to the fund that Martina was talking about. Maybe some of them are actually in the fund because, the fund exists and the company exists, but maybe you can look at proxies as we were discussing. And so what this allows you to do, for example, is to create a subgroup that is like a portfolio that could very much exist, right? And then what this functionality allows you to do is create another group, and you get to decide what this group can be. It can be a very large group of companies across an entire region, so it's a very large benchmark, or it can be a tighter group. But what this functionality allows you to do is to compare the performance, the average performance of these companies across these two groups, right? So you get a visual, but you also get the detail for all of the indicators that we have of like which group is performing above or under the other group. And this allows you to, have a lot more flexibility and detail when you assess the performance of a group of companies. So, in practicality, it's often a fund, and that's particularly relevant to LPs.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, and I guess what I would say is, where we've seen this in use cases, and Martina, you may have an example that's like this. I'm thinking of another client, but who's an LP investor in a fund, and it was really at the level of strategy, where the fund had a certain set of objectives across poverty reach, income impacts, et cetera. It was an ag focused fund. And by doing these sorts of portfolio construction and almost scenario planning of, if I had 10 companies that look like this and five that look like this, basically taking the impact thesis and constructing multiple hypothetical portfolios, um, the conversation then became the geographic thesis was not aligning with the impact aspirations. And that's not to say that's correct or not correct, but I do think the ability to just start to have a conversation saying, how important are these metrics versus these metrics versus these metrics? Would you actually change fund construction as a result of that? And so, that's where we see it getting a little bit real. I don't know if you've seen examples that are similar to that.
Yeah, and I mean, impact is multifaceted, right? So you also want to be careful that you're sort of balancing it up so that you get your low income reach, but also like your depth of impact, your scale. And some of these things at times might be in tension. So I think a tool like this is great to help you think about portfolio construction through this impact lens rather than the more traditional return, risk, and liquidity dimensions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, to be clear, of course, it's an and not an or, right? And then I guess pulling the lens back a little bit more, Martina, and then after that, I'll ask if there are other things that we didn't cover that you think would be helpful to share is obviously um, we're excited to see and we are learning from you as real partners around how you're using this and the level of integration. Um, there has to be a business case internally, right? It's a new tool. This is not part of the process before. And you've been using 60 decibels as a partner to gather data from companies for a number of years now. So how do those pieces come together and how did that business case kind of play out so that you can make the case internally, but also at a practical level, kind of what's the balance between I have the data, I have much more data accessible to me. Obviously, if it's on a specific company, then there's really no question there. But in many cases, you're constructing an estimate of what a company could be versus saying, well, that's great, but this is important enough. I actually really need to know. Maybe that's pre-investment, maybe that's post-investment. So wondering, I guess it's both the same question in whatever order, like how did you make the business case internally is part of the question. And I think the other question is then how do you decide? You have now multiple tools at your disposal. Which do you deploy and when?
Yeah. And this is all a balancing act. And of course, like different organizations are different in terms of their resourcing and their priorities. For us, I think, the option on the table is not running sort of peer-reviewed RCTs for all of our investments or
Right.
using Signal. Like this is not the trade-off we're dealing with. But it was to some extent, how many of these sort of deep, really sort of meaningful surveys or primary data collection methods, and we use a variety, do we have versus something like Signal? And the reality is like we really need both. So that then becomes a question of when do we use one, when do we use the other? And we really try to focus, like, you know, given budgetary constraints, we try to focus more in-depth studies where we really feel the data is scant or uncertain. These can be, brand new business models, um, areas where, literature and other sources are not really giving us the data we want. And that's where we would deploy other impact measurement tools. But
Yeah.
actually, we find that in 80% of cases, this data is good enough where it's not a complete match. It's often a very good match. It allows us to push deals much faster through a pipeline, which is important, where otherwise, really, the choice would have, again, it's not a choice between like incredibly rigorous methodology and Signal. The choice is not running any assessment and Signal. And for the reasons we discussed, there is an incentive to have some data, and so Signal sort of meets that. We also felt like we, as longtime partners, we've contributed to a number of these data points, and we want to continue contributing. Like the strength of Signal lies in having more data points on there from more studies that we commission or other commissions, but at the same time reaping the benefits of this huge data set that you have. And I think
Yeah.
it's working really well. And people are very sort of conscious of when, yes, the Signal data is good enough, and are usually also very straightforward when they say, well, Signal data wasn't quite good enough. If we want to know more, we need to go down a different path.
Yeah.
Making that business case was actually, I think, surprisingly simple, just because it was so obvious what the problem was. And we had sort of put ourselves more or less consciously into that problem, and Signal was the perfect solution out of it.
Yeah. Well, I do just want to reflect again. I mean, I think that reflects a level of leadership at a strategic level, and frankly, a level of courage that is, really that is what sets the stage for everything else. I have some reflections, Martina, and there are tons of questions that are going to come in. Quickly, just one person asked a question about 15 minutes ago. How does a company get on Signal? Right now, the answer to that is either the company commissions or an investor commissions a 60 decibels study of that company. One of the things that we are entertaining is whether and how we could broaden that lens. We want to have the capacity to have more companies be visible and be available, but there's more to discuss there. So before I pull the lens back, and then we'll get back to you, Martina, with the Q&A, is there anything we didn't cover that you feel like might be interesting to the audience that we should share?
No, but I said this before, and I just want to sort of reiterate again. Signal, again, how we use it, which is a lot focused on sort of poverty reach, because that's one of our priorities, is, again, serves our purposes. But the as an impact management professional, what I gain from Signal is all the other data as well. And what, again, that can be valid for when you're using proxies and comparators, or you're looking at a sector, seeing, okay, these are challenges that, say, customers typically experience with these type of companies, and using these insights as you're doing your own diligence in your investees. I think there's so much that can be used to just make sure when we're running our diligences and looking at new investments, we really are asking the right questions and we're really focusing on what matters. So just want to say, if you haven't already, exploring this data set is incredible. And I think it brings so much more power to our impact assessments overall.
Hmm. Well, that's great to hear. So I know we're going to learn more in the Q&A. I will pull back a little bit and just have some other reflections if that's all right. I guess what I would say is, ultimately our sector exists. Why be an impact investor versus just be an investor? And it is because your aspiration is to allocate capital towards things that create outsized impact, whether social or otherwise. I think our observation and my personal observation has been um, that aspiration is widely shared. And the ability to actually do that when you're allocating capital has been really hard to pull off. And so the reason that we have decided to make this data available is so that it is possible for an investor to say, if I have this thesis or this thesis or this thesis about impact, can I make part of my screening, part of my evaluation, and part of my decision making what happens, who the customers are, and what happens for those customers. And again, I don't think anybody who is in our space or anybody who's on this call would disagree with that aspiration. What I find so deeply refreshing is I'm sure we have all been in conversations about impact measurement of many stripes for over the years. And for me, those are always starting in the theory, and maybe I'm just kind of a boring practical person. But to me, it just comes down to like, well, what's your strategy? How do you operationalize it? What decisions are you willing to make or not willing to make based on these data? And so that's the reason I did want to get into with Martina and the BII team. Like, how does it actually happen? And to me, the story is so clearly framed by, I think, Martina, you said we sort of put ourselves in a tough spot on purpose, right? And so to say institutionally, we are willing to take the thing that we do, which is we find deals and we allocate capital, and we're going to integrate not just impact in general, but outcomes data in our scoring. And we're willing to say that deal isn't good enough, that deal doesn't hit the bar. And knowing that we had good data, but not great data to do that. And then from that discomfort, you create growth and create change. So that to me really is uh, I think that's what leadership looks like, frankly, is that willing to take organizational risk. Our again goal is to make that data available so people can do it well and to do it better. I think for the longest time in our sector, we've been having conversations about could you even get past outputs to outcomes. Obviously, you know, there's tons of limitations. We don't have all the companies, the data isn't perfect, etc. So the other thing I want to underline is as much as we really admire that courage, I think what you're hearing a lot of is also this is the way to get better information, to be better informed, to have a dialogue. Not to say yes or no, the data aren't perfect, just like the other data you'd get about a company aren't perfect. But I do think to the extent to which again, the point is we're talking to hundreds of thousands and millions of people around the world. If their lived experience is reflected in a quantitative way in how capital gets allocated, I think that moves our sector forward in a very meaningful way. So that is what we're excited about. And again, this is one of a number of investors who are using Signal in various ways. There's going to be time for Q&A, but before we do that, I am going to turn it over to Louis, who promise some new and improved features for which we want your feedback. So Louis, over to you.
Thanks, Sasha. Yeah, as promised, this is we wanted to show you something new and get your feedback. So I'm going to share my screen and show you what it looks like.
So
What
again,
it
maybe I'll just give a tiny bit of context here, which is we are, we if we talk to BII or we talk to somebody else, one of the questions we will obviously ask them is, can you tell us what your portfolio looks like? A lot of investors make this publicly available, others don't. But increasingly, we've been gathering these data so we can see what those interactions look like. And one of our observations has been is, gosh, isn't it strange that it's so hard to come across this data? And so in that context, Louis, maybe you can explain to folks what this map is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what this map is us doing step by step, asking one portfolio and another after another, kind of compiling what was publicly available. And it turns out that there's quite a lot that's publicly available. And we added up a lot of portfolios together. At the moment, we've got about more than 8,000 organizations, funds, or companies. It's important to mention that this map, which by the way, you should be able to access using a link that I would like to ask the team to share in the chat right now. So this is something that you are able to open yourself on any browser. It's publicly available. This map is not meant to be comprehensive, right? Like this is just whatever we could find and compile. And maybe it's not fully accurate because, as you know, portfolios change. And so the first thing I would say is if you're not on this map and you want to be on this map, if you don't want to be on this map, or if you're on this map but you're not accurately represented, you can click here on this button and just tell us how to better capture yourself on this map. And yeah, the second thing I would say is that this map is quite big, right? Like I said, more than 8,000 organizations. This is just a subset of 2,000 that you're looking at. If you want the whole thing, you can click on this little target here, but I'm not going to do that because that would be even more overwhelming. So what are you looking at, right? Well, the big blue dark dots are fund investors, right? So we got BII here. You can hover over the dots to view the name. We got other funds as I'm showing, and the smaller dots are companies, investees, portfolio companies, right? The small blue dots are companies that 60 Decibel has not worked with yet, so we don't really have data about them. We've not completed a study with them. The red dots are companies that are on Signal that 60 Decibel has worked with, right? Now that I've said that, how do you use this, right? Like you're not gonna browse over thousands of points. What you're gonna do is that you're going to look for the organization that you care about, and we're here with Martina, so we're gonna look at BII. And so once type in the organization that you want and you select it, what the interface does is that it filters out all of the organizations that are not directly linked to the one you chose, right? So what you're looking at is essentially BII's portfolio. So it's very big. There's more than 400 organizations there. As we mentioned, we can see there's funds, but also companies, right? BII does both investing into companies and into funds. And again, like it's so many companies, so maybe you don't want to hover to look for the one that you're interested in. And so instead of that, you can just type the name of the company that you're looking for, right? So maybe we can look at this particular company, which happens to be a company that we worked with before. It gets highlighted. And I guess the way to use this map, if you want to fully go through the data set, is that what you're going to do is that you're probably going to be interested in finding out about one of the investors of this particular company, right? So like you can go from one portfolio to another. And so let's look at one of the other investors of this company. And this is, yeah, like as you can see, it gets highlighted, right? But you can only see the common points between BII portfolios and this investor's portfolios, right? So if you want to see this particular investor, you would need to like go back to your left pane and select it so you get only their portfolio, right? This is, very quickly how to use this information. The other thing that I can add is, if you're looking at a company that's on Signal and you're interested in getting access to this data, you can reach out to us here. If you're interested in commissioning a study and get more customer data from this, you can also do this by clicking this button here. And yeah, that's all I have in terms of the tour. So now that I've shown you this, I would love to ask you a few questions. We got 3 questions for a poll. So if we can start the poll, it would be great. Um, and I should be there. You go. Great. So yeah, the first question is about what you think this tool is most useful for. Is it, to find potential portfolio companies or investors? Is it for business development? Maybe you're a service provider like 60 Decibels and you're interested in finding out the organizations. Is it for just research about the sector? Maybe you just don't want to use it. If it's something that's not on this list, feel free to post it in the comments in the chat. We're happy to capture that. Um, and if we have enough votes, we can go to the second question. Great, amazing. Um, and the second question should be go. The second question is about the fact that the map as it stands right now is kind of basic, right? It just has which organization invests in which other organization. And we would love to know how can we increase the value of this tool, right? Should we add output metrics like number of people reached, number of jobs created, maybe, I don't know, greenhouse gas emissions, all these types of metrics. Should we talk about impact framework, like which SDG are you pursuing? Are you 2X aligned? Do you want information about the founder, about the company? Is it a bigger company or a small company? Is it a mature company, an early stage company, or financial metrics? And look at that. This poll is magic. It's amazing. I love it. I wish I could do that all the time when I have a question and just like randomly poll 100 people and get answers. There's a last question, and then I promise that I'll give you back the floor for
I,
the Q&A.
yeah. And sorry, let's keep the results up for half a second more. I'm curious what they are. Go ahead.
Yeah, the last question is, well, it's a statement, right? We want to know, if you agree or not with the statement. I can already find this type of information easily elsewhere. My experience of that was that it was difficult. That's why this existed, but like maybe with something else, and we'd love to make sure that we find, other potential sources of information. If you do have another way to find this information, please share it in the chat as well. We'd love to know which organization it is. Well, there you go. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Very curious about the 5 people that can find this somewhere else. I hope these 5 people will share the name of the source on the chat. I would love to see it. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for participating into this. Again, the link to this map is available in the chat. We would love for you to use it, test it, reach out to us. We're hoping that this is going to help. And yeah, looking forward to hear about it. Thank you all.
And then we'll go to, sorry, I think we're going now to Q&A, but again, I would say uh, this this is going to be a publicly available resource, and we want to make it better. It's not, it's certainly not complete right now, so that's why I want that input. But if folks have ideas of how to kind of step change the quantity of data that's available, we would love to hear that. And specifically, if you're from an organization and company investor and you don't feel like the information is accurately represented, please let us know. From there, I think we're going to Q&A. Is that right, Larry?
Yep. We got Q&A. We got a lot of questions in the chat. So thank you so much. We won't be able to go through all of them, but maybe we could start with a question that I guess is more for Martina. There's a question about at what stage does BI use signal data? I know that we covered it a bit in the session, but I guess it would be helpful to just give a bit more details about that.
Yeah, and I think this is where lots of people find it surprising. We mostly use it pre-investment, so it's much less of a monitoring tool for us. That's not to say it's not, but it actually comes at its most powerful, I think, pre-investment. And then, as I was saying, our impact score also sort of gets updated ex post, so after investment, depending on performance. So that's another opportunity to use a data point, like data points that Signal provides. But I would say the incentive is greatest pre-investment.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Martina. I have another question, which is about the kind of impact metrics that are featured on Signal. Sasha, I don't know if you want to give a broad voiceover about this. I think it's probably better than me showing my screen again and going into the detail.
Yes. So again, uh, so two things. A typical 60 decibel study will collect between sort of 35 and 45 data points with a combination of quantitative and qualitative data. There's a set of standard data that are almost always in a study, which will have to do with poverty profile, um, quality of life impact, challenges experienced, net promoter score, because we find those to be relatively universal metrics of customer experience. And it could be customer or supplier. I'm just going to say customer for simplicity. So that will be universally available. And then within individual sectors, they will tend to be questions that come up more rather than less. Again, the balancing act we have is we are demand driven by our clients. So if Martina and her team commission us to do a piece of work, they are ultimately going to decide what the content is of that particular study. Which may, there are reasons why they're going to want to have the questions we ask align with questions we've asked before because there is more benchmarking, but there may be specificity that is important to them or to their strategy or to a company. And so we are looking for that commonality. The screen always is questions that the best way to get the information would be to ask a customer. So in financial inclusion, it'll be their experience of the loan, what's going on in their household, are they experiencing stress? Have they been experienced, negative collection practices, et cetera. In off-grid energy would be use of the, use of the light. Have they, stopped using kerosene? Again, impacts on the household, et cetera. So kind of the types of questions will be similar. We align as much as possible with kind of standard questions and standard metrics in these various industries. And again, there's a focus on the questions for which we have larger data sets. So right now, the data that's on Signal will be, let's say a typical study is 35 to 45 data points. It might be 25 to 30 data points on Signal. We're actually, now that we're further rolled out with Signal, we're continuing to expand that. Again, with the pro and con being the simplicity of the interface versus the completeness of the data. So you might have one question asked once with one company. It might be interesting for that company, but you won't have benchmarks. So we just more, are just trying to listen to customers to see what, how they want us to strike that balance.
Great. Um, I think obviously, see if you want to have more details about this and exactly go into the detail of which indicators are in there, you can obviously reach out to us. We're happy to set up a demo and give you all the details that you want. I would say, yeah, another question is about, and maybe this is for both of you, Martina, Sasha, how does Signal effectively overcome the barriers of reaching stakeholders in hard to reach rural areas? Um, I don't know, Martina, if you have an idea of this, Sasha can take it, I'm sure, but if you have something to share, go for it.
I'll let Sasha talk. I will say this, like Signal and 60 decibels in general. I mean, a great tool that we absolutely use and rely on more and more. Not always the tool needed for every investment and every impact assessment. And there are cases where, for various reasons, including the ability to reach certain stakeholders, we do adopt different methodologies. So it is sort of, it's a one tool that works really well as a sort of, a pretty actually broad range of cases. Doesn't necessarily work always, but I think Sasha answer more on this.
I mean, again, we can only study the people we have access to. I would say 90% of the time, 60 decibels does phone-based surveys, although we also do in-person research, because we have found that the speed, cost, quality equation works the best there. We get response rates north of 65%. So we work, our real specialization, if you will, is being able to both reach folks in difficult to reach places. Again, if they have access to cell phones themselves that they own, or they have access to ones in groups, and to work really hard to have local enumerators who can call them in their local language and give them comfort in responding to a very short survey that is very respectful of their time. So there are certainly cases where there are communities and populations that we cannot reach, and we'll work that out in that case. But by and large, we have found that cell phone penetration is high enough that more often than not, we can get the data. To be clear, you're getting the data from the people who respond and the populations that they represent. So we're always very thoughtful about that. It is hard, again, and you're abstracting up to a platform to, communicate that perfectly. And what I mean by that is, if a given intervention, 75% of the clients have access to a cell phone and 25% of them don't, then we are getting data on that 75%. So obviously it introduces some bias. And as, again, as Martina said, and what we want to emphasize here is we are not we're not trying to do anything more than or less than say this is more and better information than we might otherwise have. Let's use it to inform our conversations. We're not making decisions solely based on this information, but the comparison of that, which has some inaccuracies, versus just having no data at all. I mean, I let Martina and the team speak for themselves, but I think folks are finding that that is giving them better information than not having that, and they're cognizant of its limitations.
Great. Um, Another question has to do with, yes, are the data points and the insights publicly available for investee companies? So I guess this has to do with who gets to see the data that's on Signal. Sasha, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, that's a quick one. I mean, if a company has engaged in a study with 60 decibels, they will have access to their own data. It's very straightforward. We are working, again, we're working on logins and interfaces and all those sorts of things, but the short answer is yes.
Okay. Thank you for that. We still have 10 minutes. I'm seeing a lot of questions. It's very nice to see all these questions. There's questions about 2x alignment. People noticed that this was one of the things that were available on the platform. They're asking how is this assessed, if it's available for all the companies. So I guess, Sasha, this is, I guess, a question about the profiling information we have about the companies on Signal.
Yeah. I mean, again, we are, for all of the data that 60 decibels does not collect ourselves, we are working with partners to gather that data. So either the companies themselves, or in this case, 2x, to the extent that we can get that data in a centralized fashion. So, it's interesting for us as a company. We have been in the business up until we launched Signal about a year ago of just you know, Martina and her team would call us up and we would pick the company, we would do the study, and we'd do the next one and the next one and the next one. This sort of broader view of what other data we want to have about the ecosystem had not been a priority. So a lot of this is frankly very manual work that we're doing of asking the companies for data, but we don't want to ask them for too much or be another organization asking them for information that they've shared with others. So whether it's the case of 2x or other of those data points that are centralized in other places, we are also working with 2x and other partners to see if there's a centralized way to share that information. We'd love to do more of that. So again, if anybody who's joined us has any suggestions, this is not really our core business up until now, but it's increasingly important. And I would say actually that metadata you have around our data, we're finding is increasingly relevant to the point of what Martina is saying ultimately is for a given opportunity, either it's on Signal or there are 5 or 10 or 20 companies that are relevant. And the only way she can decide that is if we can describe in a checkbox sort of way information about business model and stage and 2x alignment and female led and all those sorts of things. So we are frankly just doing that company by company and gathering that data. But we expect there are ways to accelerate that. I don't know if Martina, you had other comments there, just more
No,
from a perspective.
yeah, and I'll say like we on just on 2x, so we tend to get this data directly from the investee, but there's been known of like cases where the data we get from the investee maybe doesn't match the data on Signal. And again, that's a good opportunity to start a conversation. So all this says like it's just helpful to have another data source and then sort of question why they may be somewhat different.
Great. I've got a very good one for you, Martina. Well, how do organizations like BII reconcile or balance or prioritize social impact metrics with financial metrics in investment deals?
I can do a whole webinar on this. It's one of my favorite topics.
You have five
But
minutes.
yeah, no, I mean, short answer is we actually have an asset allocation framework where impact is one of the core dimensions. And I think we're a bit in a pioneer from that perspective. So we do look at, when we think about our portfolio construction and asset allocation, impact is a key dimension that we think about and maximize for. It's not just done on a deal by deal basis. And as we construct our portfolio and look at opportunities, the conversation we have at IC is very much how does this investment meet our very disparate and sometimes contradicting targets, which include returns, but also risk and liquidity. And it's a balancing act. That's at the end of the day the answer. There is a paper online we published if anyone wants to sort of get into the detail of this online about how we think about exactly this problem.
Amazing. Sasha, it seems that maybe we need to just clarify a bit about like how organizations that work with us access their data versus the whole data sets. If you can just clarify, remind people how this works.
Oh yeah, I mean individual companies will have a login that will give them access to those results is the short
Right.
answer.
Um, Great.
And
We
sorry, yeah,
have.
and they can only see, sorry, I'm just looking at Luis's question. It says, can you clarify if a company has data, can they see their own data or the whole database? They can see their own data and their performance relative to the benchmark, but they cannot see other individual companies. Of course, anybody can subscribe to any parts of the data set, but what a company will see is its own results and benchmarks.
Mhm. I have a question about are we considering partnering with other tools in the industry that support other stages of the deal cycle? Um, Sasha? I know, Martina, you mentioned that you guys were using a range of solutions and the Signal was one of them. So I think the answer is clear there, but Sasha, what do you think
I
about
mean,
that?
yeah, I would love to hear more about which tools. I mean, again, as I was sharing before, I think the most value here and the reason we're making the map publicly available is I just think there's a lot of information sitting in silos and sitting on people's hard drives. So to the extent to which we could make that map a real resource that is aggregating all of this data, hopefully that's useful for everybody. And to the extent to which there are other, look, I would love nothing more. This is a much to Martina's hour. This would be a kind of an hour of brainstorming. We are going very, very deep on a very specific thing, which is what does a customer say about their lived experience of a product or services? There's tons of additional data we could even at the level one study, let alone all the data on Signal that we would love to combine that with. Geolocation, other assessments of companies, all those sorts of things. So, we are just at the infancy of kind of pulling all those pieces together. And the choices we're making are around how do we optimize the experience that Martinez talked about, which is help an organization of BII's size integrate outcomes data into its deal process and into its research and into its, fund investments. So that's really what we're focusing on is that data, but there's so much more there. So that's kind of the push and pull. I see a question also, which is sort of related to Wanda, which is 60 decibels going to place this data within easy reach of potential investors? I mean, absolutely. That's our goal and that's our aspiration. And we're doing aggressive, frankly, outreach to all of our customers and potential customers to say, we want to make this more available. The other thing we didn't really talk about is to the extent to which we can. We try to even do matchmaking. We are also limited in our own bandwidth, but to the extent to which a company is a super strong performer on our metrics, we want to get them highlighted. So all of those things, just to go back to the comments I had made earlier, we want capital to flow and we want capital flows for lots of reasons. It's been very difficult for capital to systematically flow towards outsized impact. It's not the only thing that investors going to ever make a decision on, nor should it be. But we want to make that much more possible. And so we're going to take as many steps as we can especially for those top performers to help them be seen.
Yeah, and
Uh,
just to sort of answer the previous question, if I could sort of, wave my magic wand and get what I need, like, again, the data provided here at 60 decibels, it's great data, it's very rich. It does speak to a specific element of impact and way to see impact. If I could log onto a platform and for every company know its carbon footprint, it's, different ESG risks, any governance issues, and this data and like that of course would be the dream. So at the moment we're still working with different solutions to get all these different data points, but Sasha, if that could be your next you know
Listen,
your next
really, I
product
mean,
development.
we really would love it, and I do think that there's so much more out there. But I think it is an important point. Like we're trying to really go deep on a particular part of this challenge, and again, as Martina said, it is about adding richness to one part of an evaluation, of which there's lots of other richness, both on social and environmental factors, as well as operational, financial, leadership, team, business model, you name it. But we have just, we have felt that the data that enters this part of the conversation is so much less rich than the data entering other parts of the conversation that whether intended or not, it seems less important in how capital is allocated. And that doesn't seem like what all of us want to have happen. And really that's our hope. So that said, we are at the top of the hour. I really want to thank not only everybody for coming, but everyone for staying. I think it's any webinar I've been on, like getting everybody to stay to the end. So I think it's because we polled you thank you for weighing in on that. We will follow up. There's some requests for links, answers to the polls, all those sorts of other things. And of course, if you have more questions about that you didn't get answered, please let us know because this is just the start of this conversation. So thank you, everyone. What a great way to start our Wednesday, wherever you are. I hope it's warmer for you than it is for me. It's in single digits Fahrenheit here in New York, under 2 feet of snow. So take care, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.